So yesterday, we spent quite a bit of time learning about one of the new CSS3 specific layout mechanisms, the flexbox. Um, there is another more powerful thing built into CSS3 that makes laying out your site, making your site structures incredibly easy, and that is CSS Grid. We've kind of been hinting at it for the last week or so, but now we're actually going to play with it and explore and see how we can use it to set up our page sections. So what is it, right? At its core, it's really just a grid, right? And so for those of us who have been doing this a long time, like Olivia, like harkening back to the table days of web design, CSS Grid really gives us the same flexibility we have with tables, where we can say, I want this row to be here, I want this column to be here, I want it to span this number of elements, so that it creates essentially a flexible grid that we can place all of our elements into. Here it comes. Hold that thought. Cool. So we left off. We were talking about the fact that we have all these options now that are available to us in CSS3, right? That make web development and making layouts for our pages much simpler. So the difference, the main difference between Flexbox and Grid is really the dimensionality, right? So Flexbox is excellent when you've got a single order that you want to order these things in, right? Whether it's horizontal, which is the default in Flexbox, or as a column, which is one of our options when we pick the flex direction. CSS Grids tries to replicate the structural elements of how most designers build web products, right? So you're going to generally segregate your applications in terms of like, this is my menu, this is my header, this is my logo, here's the content blocks. CSS Grid gives us that flexibility by saying, hey, I'm going to place this header, it's always going to be in the top left. That's where my logo goes. In the top right, it's always going to be my menu. In the left, it's going to be a menu for navigation. That's going to go all the way down to the bottom of the page. And in the middle, I'm going to have all kinds of little panels that show up when I need them to. Grid gives us that control in a way that we didn't have before without using something like tables or getting really complicated with floats and moving things around, so that they're always floating up against each other and we're clearing things left and right. So how do we use grids? Rather than go down this spreadsheet and talk about each individual thing, I think it's probably more efficient to just start with a more realistic example. So we're going to go to W3 Schools and say CSS grids because they have some really good examples here, right? So this is kind of the structure. If you kind of envision your head, this would be a regular, 3-column layout that has a menu that spans all the way down, a footer, a main content area, and a right area. So let's just take a look at this and work our way down. So just like with Flexbox, right? So this is our HTML structure, right? So this is the kind of the stuff we've been the stuff we've been focused on yesterday. And if we just ignore the CSS for a minute, right? We're simply defining, hey, this is the H1 at the top of the page. Let's take this out so that it's a little cleaner. Rerun. Perfect. So this is how we would define our page, right? We're saying this is the structure that we're going for here. This is what we want our elements to be put together. It's going to start with a class or a main container that we're going to say, hey, this is display grid. And from here on out, the CSS rendering engine's grid controller is going to take care of placing all of these elements that are inside of it. Inside of that, we've got a couple different elements defined. We've got a header element defined, a menu element defined, a main element defined, a right, and a footer, right? The order of these doesn't necessarily matter, right? Because the grid engine is deciding where to place these things, right? So the footer, put this up here, right? Structurally, none of that matters. Where we've been concerned about design previously, when we've been talking about HTML, by default, everything kind of renders from top to bottom in the order that it shows up in our HTML. And we've been learning to break that by doing things like floating elements or telling it to flex or putting it in a table so that it doesn't show up where it shows up in the code. If we go back to how it was, right? So the structure of the elements in this grid do not matter. So let's talk about how to actually define a grid. There are two really main components here. The first is the grid container itself. We're going to turn this on by saying display grid. This is the foundation of making this happen. So we've learned about display block, which is the default for divs. We know about inline, which is the default for spans and strong tags and things that don't take up space. And then yesterday we learned about flex, right, which turns it into a flex box type of thing. Let's see what happens if we do this, right? So this is a flex, right? One dimension, and it's doing the exact same thing that you would expect a flex box to do. It's saying the header was first, then the menu, then the main, then the right, and the footer. But as soon as we say grid, it opens up a whole bunch of interesting options for us with some new CSS properties. And we're going to look at, so this is one of the more complicated ones, grid template areas, where you're saying, hey, this is basically we're basically breaking this up into 6 individual sections, right? Header, 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 right? So 3 and 3. So we're kind of, think of it like we're writing our cell names in a string that goes in the grid template areas property, right? And this is laid out this way just so it makes it easier to see. We could have also, I think this will work. Let's just verify. I'm just taking out all the extra quotes and stuff, right? Oh, yeah, so it has to be on 3 separate lines. That's interesting. So the format for this is, right, you'll generally create your template area. Then you'll say, hey, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right? And then like this, right? So it's 3 separate strings broken out by line. And if we click run again, now it's back to how it was. The number, or the name of these elements in here is completely up to you, right? The fact that it says header here and header here does not matter. Right? If we change these to, like brand, okay? What is defining these is in the item itself, right? So inside of our container, we have a number of elements, right? Each of these elements, in this case, has a class. So this one's item 1, this is item 2, item 3. Each of those class definitions has a special property in CSS called grid area, where you put in the name that you have put in this template, right? So if I run this right now, the header disappears. It doesn't know what to do with it because there is no template area called header anymore. I took it out of the template. But if I change this now to brand, it goes back to how it was. So just like with what we were doing yesterday when we were setting up the structure of our page, and we were just really thinking about what are the class names going to be, what are the elements that need to be there, this is an opportunity for us to write CSS code that describes the vision of what it is we're trying to accomplish with our template, right? And these just have to be kind of lined up, right? So, I've seen sometimes where people will try to line these up so it looks kind of like the words match. It'd be tough to do it with this because we got footer, which is a big word, right? But visually, like, we're just showing off here that, like, the first row of this interface is brand, 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 right? So that's the header. It's going to take up all 6 columns, okay? If I was to duplicate this, right, let's see what happens if we go like this, right? It does nothing because there's no extra information here. But if we did something like this, maybe, let's try main. Well, that breaks everything. Oof. How can we, how can we show this off? All right, so like, here's an example, right? So this has the menu, and the menu is scrolling kind of horizontally through 2 rows, right? You see that menu goes on the main and the right. We could also say that, main here takes up 3, right takes up 2. We can make this main here, right here. And now it's going to be even smaller. You see that it kind of stretches that out? We could also make the menu bigger, right? We can say menu, 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 right? And so now menu takes up more space. We're just really, this template area is saying, I'm going to tell you what elements belong in this area by saying the grid area is this. Okay. Any questions about that? Where was it? Go ahead.
So did you say it was it'll always be 6 by 3?
No. So I could have made this 3 by 3. Right? I could have said brand, 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 then menu, main, right, menu, main, right, okay. And then I could do menu, footer, footer. It's doing the exact same thing. If you need more control of the placement of your elements, like if you wanted menu to take up more space than main or right, then you have to add additional areas, right? So this was the main question we were asking yesterday, is like, what type of layout are you making? If you're doing 3-column, generally that means you've got a small sidebar, a big middle content area, and a small right bar, right? So in that example, you'd probably want to do a 4, right? You'd want to say footer, brand, right? So now main takes up more space than if we were to go bigger, right? So this is kind of the traditional 3-column type of layout. And some places will not have the menu go past the footer, right? So that this would be like the actual traditional 3-column layout, right? Footer, where you've got a footer at the bottom, at the very bottom of the page, a header at the top, and then you've got a menu, a bigger main, and a smaller right. Right? This would be like your normal type of, like, the traditional 2000 through 2010 era website or web application. But what this lets us do is that we have the flexibility to decide what is the most important thing, right? We can, just by moving these grid template areas around, if we decide, hey, we don't want the menu on the left, we want the menu on the right, right? We can just simply go, right, like this, and say menu. Right? So now the menu is on the right of the main. We can decide we don't want a right bar at all. We can say menu. Oh, and now we would have to delete the right, right? So now we have a 2-column layout. Or, right, we can come in here and say, where was that? Right. We can decide, right, that our main needs to take up even more space, right? So we can just add extra things, right? We can say main, right? We want our main to take up 4 columns worth, and so then we would need to have brand, right? So that's 4, 5, 6. Yep, 6. Then footer, right? And maybe what we want to do is have the menu, and right go down into the footer, right? So the main is a bigger area. And let's see. So we can structurally build our HTML without any care at all of where those elements are going to be placed in our style, in our structural style. And then we can just simply come in here and decide where it will be placed just by fiddling with this grid template areas. Right? Let's say maybe we wanted to do, instead of this being right, a right menu, maybe we want this to be its own entire row. So let's say menu. We can come in here and say right, menu. And now we still have a big menu, and maybe we want to make that smaller because we care more about the content than we do the what did I do? I meant main. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Gotta take this out. Right, so you see the problem that happened here, right? If you look at these as columns, right, and I'll try to line it up so it's maybe easier to see. Right. We broke making this even a legal design, right? Because we said, hey, main, menu, main, right, menu. So this menu right here breaks that flow because you cannot have a box that curves around another box like that. All right, so now if we fix that, now you see we got main, right, footer. And if we decided for some reason, hey, we want the footer to go the full length, now it does. So grids gives us a ton of flexibility in structurally laying out our page. Now, this content down here, this is never what your code is going to look like, right? These are just containers for where the actual content is going to go, right? So this would really be, like H2, site name, right? And then down in your content area, menu. This would be like an unordered list, right? UL, LI, page 1, LI, page 2, UL. Okay, and then main would have some actual content. Maybe it has an H3 in here, right? H3 article title, H3, and then, some paragraph. Right? So the content itself, we're gonna make that ourselves. That's the exercise we were doing yesterday when we were saying, let's just figure out what goes in our blocks when we're building our pages, right? We're gonna say this is a perfect example. These are unstyled, right? They look terrible. This is not what we would want our page to look like. But if we structurally put together our HTML blocks, our content that we're going to put into the page, now, once we got everything laid out and we can say, yeah, that feels right, now it's time to go and style it and make it look pretty. So the other important thing to note here is there is a CSS property here called grid gap. Grid gap. And what that does is it provides the spacing in between these grid elements. Okay, so think of this as like the margin of those divs. Grid gap is going to control the spacing between each and every grid element. So if we say 0px, right, those blue lines disappear altogether. If we say 10px, right, that's what it looked like when we loaded it, you get those blue lines back. And the reason you get those blue lines back is because there's a background color here behind the scenes, and it matches the same background color of the page. Yeah, right in here. Oh, that's the background color of the divs. So this page background color comes through. If you imagine this blue is from the grid itself, the grid container. You'll also note that if we change this, right, if we change this to 5, it's a little bit smaller now. The outside border is still big because that is still controlled by the padding attribute, right? That's still a padding property. And there is still a margin behind the scenes as well, right? Right now I think it's 0px by default, but if we made this something like 10, right, it's pushing out around the rest of the body tag and stuff. And the only way, right, we defined this grid template areas where we're saying this is where I want you to place these elements. This only works if we give each of the elements that we want to have be placed. This tells this that this belongs in the grid. If we were to take this out, for example, and give this a name that doesn't work, ASDF, right? It doesn't know where to place this. There is no ASDF in our grid template areas, so it just kind of breaks the flow. So it's important to keep in mind that grid template areas is going to be the names that you're going to define in the elements that belong in your grid, right? And we could have come in here, right? So we were fiddling with this before. What was this one? Main. Yeah. So we have we said, hey, item 3 is main, item 4 is right. If I put this in main, right, that overlaps them. Let's say they both occupy the same grid space, right? This says right, and it's over top of the one that's below it. So you have to be very careful making sure that the names and stuff match up. But being able to do this in essentially 3 lines of code, right? Display grid and then setting up your template here. This would have taken 70, 80 lines of code and a lot of frustration and wailing and angry moans 10 years ago. This is revolutionary structurally. Now, if you're going to build a single column app or something, like this is overkill, right? Flexbox is a better choice for that because you're working in one dimension most of the time. Or sometimes you don't even need Flexbox if you really are truly just doing a single column app, right? Like divs automatically stack from top to bottom. No Flexbox needed. Did you have a question?
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, the whole floating thing and all of, like, grids and stuff is the whole reason I went back to graphic design. So I'm so glad it's changed.
Yeah, it's much easier now. It's very, and Schuster kind of mentioned this today. Like one of the skills that we're going to hopefully develop with you guys over the next, what do we have left? 9 weeks or so, is it's very important to learn how to debug, right? So if I'm in here and I, I'm on the wrong one. If I type in, menu here, and it was working a minute ago, and now it's all of a sudden jumps to that. It's like, what did I do wrong? How, having the techniques and having the skill to look at your actual code objectively and to say, what is the thing that is wrong here? And maybe sometimes the way you find this out, like grids are one of those ones that doesn't have really good tooling around it yet. There's no good debugger. Just being able to like kind of space these out a little bit so you can be like, okay, everything on the top is brand. That's probably fine. Then it goes main, menu. That's fine. Then it goes menu. Oh, this menu's out of place. Like, this is an attention to detail thing. The same could have been true, right? If I had footer, right? Good. If I, had a typo here and I said footer, right? That breaks it too. So just having a single letter wrong causes everything that you think is working. Like, if you were actually on a live site that had actual divs with content in here and you typed one wrong letter, now your page looks like a hot mess. Like, how do you get yourself out of those problems? And knowing that, like, hey, I'm in here typing letters in here, like, I need to be able to check. Like, if it starts to overlap like this, your first place you should maybe look is where you've defined your grid template areas, so that you can come in and be like, oh, yep, that for sure is the wrong letter. Oh, and I still have that one over top. Yep, right. So knowing how to find these problems, how to track them down, is a big part of being a software developer. And when we get into JavaScript next week, the techniques we use to debug our problems is going to be completely different than what we've done to debug our design problems or HTML problems. So it's a whole bunch of problem-solving techniques that we're hopefully just going to get you exposed to. Like, when we're doing these homework assignments and you need to ask help from Selena or myself or Eric, like, part of that process, we intentionally say, did you Google this first? Have you, what have you tried? Just to get you in the mindset of, like, when you're really working in this environment, like, how do you get out of these problems on your own? Because when you're getting paid $40,000, $50,000 to $60,000 a year, every time you have a typo, you can't go running to your boss and be like, I don't know why this isn't working. They're gonna be like, what did you try? What were you just typing, right? The problem is almost always going to lie with whatever you just did. And so getting into a cycle of writing a line or two of code, saving it, looking at it, and making sure that the output matches up with what you were doing, what you were expected to have happen, is a really good skill. You'll notice that I do this pretty often in the class. I'll write a few lines of code, I'll save it, and I'll look at it in the browser. What does it look like? And then if I have a problem, I know that it's just with the 5 or 6 lines I just wrote. Cool. Any questions about this? There's a whole bunch of other options in here. We're going to just kind of breeze through some of them, especially when they're interesting. So we talked about grid gap. That's the spacing between grid elements. Let's look at grid template rows. So that's at grid template areas, right? That's the one that I think is like the best version of grid. But this is not, right? If we just took grids at face value, right? Grids have a whole bunch of options that, like, it doesn't have to be this complicated. So let's see, how can we show this off, right? Did grid template columns, grid template areas, right? So let's look at that first. Grid template columns. Grid template columns. Right? So if you did not want to display that big complicated grid template area thing that we were working on before, by default, right? This is the same kind of design, right? So it's the same kind of structure as Flexbox. You can come in here and say, my display is a grid, and my grid template columns it's 4 columns long, auto, auto, auto. And the auto is saying, I want that to be auto sized, right? So you'll notice that it's like this. If I put another auto in here, now we're going to have a 5 column layout. Okay? And you'll notice that the 6, 7, and 8 elements went to the bottom. And they're all auto. If I put in a specific value here, right? This what goes in this grid template columns is the size, right? So if I put 20 px, right? We're going to have a very tiny first column, and the rest of them are auto, right? We can also put percentages in here. We can say 30%. And so now that one grows and shrinks a little bit, but it took up a bigger initial space. That's grid template columns. We still have grid gap in there. That's what's providing the spacing between the boxes, but that's primarily just to show off, like in this design, how these are being placed. But grid template columns, grid gap is a good way to keep things separate or give them a little bit of margin automatically. But if you did not want to use grid template area, which was this one that we looked at, grid template areas, where we're defining, these are my structures, right? All you need to do to get grid working is to say display grid, and then you can either do it by column or by row, right? So if you wanted to have a one column layout, right? Oh, it's got, take this out. There you go. That's a one column layout. If I wanted to have a two column layout, auto, do it again. And these are going to gracefully resize. And if we were to add extra elements in here, right? If our page was extra big, right, I'm going to put an 8th in here, right? Boop. It just plops right into place. No muss, no fuss. That is the grid template columns option. I think that the grid template columns also has some really cool properties. Let me see if I can, if it's listed on this page. Yeah. So max content is a really interesting one, right? So instead of putting auto, where it's, let's see, auto, let's just take that out, so we'll go back to 4 columns, right? Auto sets their initial size to be like, hey, just give everything the same width, right? Because we didn't, if we'd had one in here that was like, 100 px, it's going to make that column be fixed to that size. Let's put in some big content in one of these. Let's say 7. Like, hello world, this is a fun example of max content. Okay, so you'll notice that that has blown up that size, okay, but it still tries to shrink. If I was to come in here and say that column 4 is max content, right, it automatically will try to make that always be the size of the content that is in that box. Okay? So in this case, this is text. Text is by default kind of an inline thing. So what it's going to do here is it's going to say whatever the size of the element that's inside of this is the size that this is the minimum size this column can go. So if I was to come in here and put a div that had a style of width 200 px, right? Let's make it small. Right, so now this text is contained inside of an element that has a size of 200 pixels. Now the size of that column is always going to be 200 pixels because the content inside of it is 200 pixels. So auto says, hey, just stretch, do whatever you want to do. Max content says, figure out the size that I need to be to display the elements in the page, or you can put in an actual size, whether it's a number or a percentage, right? Any of the CSS units that we've looked at before, right, we can put in here, and I want it to be 10 view width. So now it's tied to the size of this this panel. We can also do weird stuff too. We can say like, I want this to be 10 view height, right? So however high my thing is, however big, however tall my display is how, right? How big that, how big the width of that will be, right? So you can see as I shrink my monitor, that column goes wider or smaller. Let's make 30. Right? So you can do anything that's a valid CSS size unit can go in this here. And if we wanted to make this a 3 column layout, how would we do that? All we've got to do is take out one of these units. And so if I do that, now we're a 3 column layout. If I want to make it a 2 column layout, we're here. Boom. That is the grid template columns option. Now, there's also, I believe, a grid template rows. Right? So if you wanted to do it the other way, right? So let's take a look here. So this is saying this is a 2-row interface. And you're setting the height of those things. Let's take this out and see what happens. Yeah. Okay. So you always need to have grid template columns, but if you want to control the height or size or spacing of the rows themselves, right, you can come in here and specify sizes here, right? So if we did auto, right? We could even put, like, if we ever have a 3rd column, right, you'll notice that this has added a row even though there's no content in there. Can you kind of see that size? If we added a couple more, it'd probably be even easier to see. Auto. There are invisible rows here that are taking up space because we have a grid gap. If I change this grid gap to 0, now it's there. But if for some reason I needed my 4th row to be, 400 pixels, it's going to preserve that space for us. even though there's no content in there. Where would you use grid template rows? If I'm that concerned about the height of the content in my rows, I'm almost always, if I get to this level of complexity, I'm almost always just going to switch over and go into grid template areas. I'm going to lay these out myself. Generally, it's not a good idea to control the height of your elements unless you're doing it for a very specific purpose. Most of the time, we expect the content that goes in our elements to grow, right? We expect users to type in long stories, so we need our content to grow down with us. And so when we put in fixed sizes with us, I mean, that was what was causing our issues with, that Pinterest clone I was showing off yesterday, and we have to solve that. The more complex or the more control we try to have over the height of our elements, the more we have to do behind the scenes to make it work. But that is, I just want to point out that is an option for you. Let's look at grid auto rows, for example. Grid auto rows. There's a whole bunch of grid-specific properties, and honestly, it's one of those things where you get used to using one specific thing. This is one of those things where if it's got a grid dash prefix, it's a grid specific thing. You might have to go look up what it does and go in here and play with it, right? So grid auto rows. This would be a good example of, right, if you needed to set the height of these elements, right? This does it for every row instead of worrying, right? We could also still do auto in here, right? We could say, hey, just however much space you need, that's how much space to take. This is the default. But if you wanted to set a property for every row, right? Grid template rows lets us do that manually. But if you just want to say, hey, you remember when we were doing grid template rows, if I added extra rows in there, it would preserve space in there. But if I wanted to say, hey, I want every row to be 150 pixels tall, right? It does not have that extra space because I don't have a third row. But if I was to add an extra element in here, let's make this one also will be 150 pixels. Oh. Why did it not do that? Okay, grid gap, good. Display grid. Oh, it's because that's item 6, right? So this shared a class that already had a space defined for it above. So I'm going to have to make an item 6 class. Item 7. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so this will have to be 3. Perfect. Cool. And you'll notice that we're using the grid area option here. So let's take a look at grid area because the syntax is kind of wild. This is the same as if we wanted to use the grid template areas. Or you'll notice this is by name. Well, this method, right, using the exact same property, if we don't have names in here, we're defining the coordinates. We're saying it's on the 3rd row in the 4th position, right? And you can kind of visualize this here, right? Like 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 3, 1, 3, 2, 4, right? So if we look at the actual documentation for grid area, it describes all of the options that you can put in this property, grid area. So a lot of these properties are reused based on the way you're setting this up, right? So you can choose, right? The first is what row it starts on, what column it starts on, and if it spans a certain number of rows, right? So what we were doing with the grid template areas earlier, right? In this example, I could say, span 3, span 3. I want it to start in the first, span 2. Span 2 down. Oops. Span 3. Right? So it's doing that same thing, just doing it with this complicated format where we're saying it starts here and goes until here, or it starts here and is on this thing in this position. Right? So we can specify if it spans rows or columns similarly to how we were defining it with this grid template areas where we're saying, hey, this is here, this is here. This is, if this was grid area main, for example, it would be the same as saying 2 span 6. 1 span 6. 2. span 5. Oh, it doesn't span. It spans 4, 5, 4. See, this gets kind of fiddly, right? So as soon as I get to this level of complexity, I'm almost always going to just switch over to this because it's easier for me to visualize where these things are going, right? So it would have to probably be like this, maybe. Nope, that's columns. Span 2. Yeah. So every time I do this, I have to go and be like, okay. So make item 1 start on row 2, column 1, and span 2 rows and 3 columns. Oh, so I'd have to do. Where was it? Right. Another slash. Span 4. Oh. Row 2. First position. Takes up 1 row and spans 4. Okay, so article title. So this is our content block. Put this there. Nope. Oh, I got it. This is supposed to be span 4. And this is, and then slash 1. Dang it. I don't know. This is a fiddly format. I don't like it. I like this way. And we could debug it, but we'd probably have to like go read the documentation and try to figure out why it's not working. Maybe this is already showing up as multiple things. And it's not a good idea to mix and match types. But if you wanted to set up your grid in this type of way, you could do so. Also, right, this is us being pedantic. This is us picking the locations of things. So just like with everything else, right, all you need to make this a grid is to have the container be a grid. So if we did not need this kind of control, right, we could say, hey, this is just a grid. And we can say, hey, the rows, this is a 2 column, right? Columns. What's going on here? I shouldn't mix and match our examples. Any questions about this, right? So this is probably the preferred way to use grids, where you can set up structurally like this is how my page looks. There are a bunch of other power functions in here that are kind of fiddly, but sometimes interesting. And you saw, like, this is just one of those things you have to play with. I hardly ever use any of those other mechanisms. What I will do is lay out my entire site with this. Like 90% of the time. This is the best way. If you want a complex looking site filled with divs, you got menus, headers, footers, this is the best way to do it. Because at any time, you can change the structure of your site by changing just this single grid template areas. Any questions? We're good? All right. It is 6:06. When we come back, we're going to play a little bit with some of the justifications and centering options that are available to us with grids. It's going to feel very similar to Flexbox, where you can justify things, align things, move it to the left, move it to the right, have it be centered, have it be baseline. We'll play with that when we come back at 6:06. Let's take a quick break. Come back at 6:20. 6:20. And so this favicon file, right, the one that we're going to talk about first is the actual icon file, right? This is an old-fashioned format of an image, right? It is a .ico file. And so what our browsers are smart enough to do, if I was to pull up where was it at? Flexbox. All right. Don't save. Good. So this was the fake Pinterest project that I was making, right? As like an example when we were playing with Flexbox, right? So you'll notice that when I go to this website to begin with, it has the default, hey, there's no site icon here. So on Google Chrome, it's like looks like some kind of globe type of icon. It's kind of hard to see, right? Firefox is going to have a different type of thing. Internet Explorer is going to have a different. Safari has a different. Like if the site doesn't have an icon, it's going to render this. But the original format of favicon said, whenever I make a request to the page, the browser is going to look for favicon.ico at the same level as the page. So you call index.html, As soon as that request goes through, the browser behind the scenes is looking for favicon.ico. And because it doesn't find it, right, this is a 404 error, cannot get, the browser then defaults to displaying their default thing. So to show this off, we're just going to copy this. I have to pull this up. I'm going to extract this whole folder. Perfect. Okay, right. I'm going to take this icon, favicon.ico, and just drag it into my project. So now it's there. It's an icon file format. And now, if I reload this page, that's there. And you'll notice that immediately, this is being used as the icon for my website. This is happening automatically. As soon as you dump a file called favicon.ico in there, it will render. Now, by rule, by specification, it's supposed to be a .ico file. But you can sometimes get away because browsers are very polite. You know, if you dropped a PNG in there but just named it .ico, favicon.ico, as long as it has that name, favicon.ico, you know, sometimes it will load. So let's try that, right? So we have some, what is this? This is a PNG, right? This is a big 512 by 512 PNG file. So I'm going to, let's rename this as old favicon, right? I'm going to rename this one favicon.ico. And if we actually view, these probably still PNG, huh? Yep. So this is actually favicon.ico.png. Well, so I don't have to do this in the command line. Let's go there. CD to Flexbox. Oh, I need to do it from the downloads folder. CD, downloads, favicon, ico 2. Right, that's the folder. Oh, CD, downloads, CD. Oh, I'll just move the. Yeah, I'll do this way. This will be simpler. I'm gonna copy. That. Where'd it go? Oh, this one. Copy. I'm gonna paste it into my project. Paste. Oh, I'll have to drag it, huh? Drag it. So you see that it's actually favicon.ico.png here. I'm trying to see if we can get it so that will Chrome still. Oh, what did we do? No. CD. CBC13, good. The Flexbox. Alright, so I've got favicon.ico and favicon.ico.png. I'm going to move favicon.ico.png into favicon.ico. So now it's basically overwritten that one file with. So this is actually a PNG, and you'll notice it shows up as a big and beautiful image. If I was to reload our page, yeah, Chrome behind the scenes is loading this even though it's not an ICO file, and it's still putting this up here. It's not best practice. So you'll see generally when you generate a favicon like this folder did, it's giving you an actual favicon.ico and then a bunch of other resolution formats. Okay, that is the first way. Favicon.ico is going to be looked for when you go to the page. There's another thing we can do, though, that is even cooler, and this is in the HTML. So we can come into our index, and there is a link rel equals icon, and we tell it what image to use. Right, so if I was to pick a different image, what we got here? Is that the alien thing? Yeah, that's the alien thing. Just down. Let's edit one of these. That'll be fun. I'm going to copy this. Oh, I need to paste it. Never mind. Did it go? Oh, I'm in the compressed folder. That's annoying. So I'm going to copy this over. I'll take the 192 version, right? And if I go and edit this in our CBC13 folder, just so we can. I have an edit with Paint 3D. Perfect. So I'm just going to draw on this so we can see that we're. Now I've got an ugly blue alien, right? And we'll file save. Where's the save thing at? Menu. Save. Good. So now, right, it's this blue one. In my HTML, I'm going to rename this so it's. I don't have to type out this. Let's just say new favicon.png. I can come in here and specify that I want to use the site's icon as new favicon.png, and the browser should use this instead, right? And so you'll see it automatically does this. It's still gone and it's fetch favicon.ico because the browser's like, I don't know if you have an icon defined or not. But because we specified one in here, in our HTML, it's got that as well. And if we were to do a hard reload with our network thing up, you might be able to see this happening in real time. Yeah, so it says it loads index.html, then it loads style.css, then it loads whatever 175 was. Oh, that's the image from this placeholder image. Then it's loading whatever the heck that is. Oh, that's the live server code. But then it says, hey, it starts to process the HTML file, and it says, hey, I've defined a favicon for this page. Go and get it for me. So it goes and fetches that as a part of the request. Okay? If we were to take this out, right, take this out and do a hard reload on our page, right, you'll notice that it goes back to saying, give me favicon.ico. So it's going to read our HTML first to see if there's an icon. And if there is one provided, it will use that. Generally, what most places will do to just get the widest possible coverage is that they'll say favicon.ico is here for old browsers who maybe don't know about the link rel style sheet thing. Just as a fallback, you'll notice that it's, if we were to look at the actual image itself, oh, that's the PNG, right? So the actual favicon.ico file format is like really small. It's bad resolution, right? It's if we zoom in on it, we can see we lose a lot of image fidelity, but that's fine for a site icon like this. The reason we'd want to specify the link rel is it lets us use more higher resolution images, and you'll even notice these are named a certain way. Apple Touch icon, Android Chrome 192 by 192. Whenever you're on a mobile app, whenever you're on a mobile interface and you say, hey, I want to save this website to my home screen or whatever it is on Apple, you want to make it like so that you can press a button on your phone desktop and go right to this page full screen. It's going to see, do you have one of these defined in a size that I like, and use that image. So on an Apple Retina interface, right? Like this is a really high resolution image that supposedly looks a lot better. So you can define multiple icons in your HTML for all of those different sized images. And the device itself will choose which one to use. And I never remember the syntax for this, so let's just go look this up. Link rel icon for mobile phones, right? Because there's like a syntax that each of these, yeah, so they'll say, link rel Apple Touch icon, then you can put in a sizes attribute and then specify an image for it, right? So Apple is looking for all of these. If you're on an iPad or a tablet or something like that, it's going to try and use the Apple Touch icon. Then, like Safari, I don't know what any of that stuff means. If there's an Android Chrome one, right? So the most important thing is that if you've got a sized image specifically, by putting in the sizes attribute, any device that doesn't know what to do can default to saying, well, I'm looking for a 64 by 64 pixel wide image. Give me that instead. So what you'll often see is, for commercial websites, they'll have 5 or 6 different versions of their icon defined on every page so that each and every device can get the best possible. Like, if you're thinking of this as, like, you're building a product, right? You work at Google or something, right? Google, right? This G, they probably spent $1 million designing. They want it to look amazing on each and every device, whether it's an icon for a mobile app or, the favicon that goes in the browser title. So they're going to go out of their way to specify each and every one of these different types of options so that it looks the best on their users' machines. Favicons. Any questions? You should never have a website that doesn't have a favicon. It looks really sloppy. Even if it's just simply going to, free favicon generator, right? Something like that. Like, here you go. You can put letters, like my favicon for my website. This looks terrible, right? But it's just EH. And it looks better on gray, but like on this green background, red was probably a bad choice, right? Like, it's not that hard to make these types of images. You can use emoji. You can use anything, right? So just put something up there. Makes it look cool. Makes your page stand out in a sea of tabs when you are a developer and you have hundreds of tabs open. You can't remember where you left off. So like for your movie site, right? Maybe there's a nice movie, or maybe what type? Camera, maybe. Oh, I probably have to type in here, huh? Objects. Yeah, there's probably a camera or something in here. Maybe one of these, or oh, there you go, a clapperboard. That'd be perfect for your movie site. And then maybe what you do to just personalize it, because you don't want your, you want to have something unique. Maybe you put like the Augusta A or something behind here, so that it looks personalized to film in Augusta. All right, any questions? All right, it is 6:40. Now it's time for y'all to keep working on your film project. So the next step from where we left off yesterday, we got kind of the structure of the page ready to go. And so if we were to pull up, I can pull up because I have checked it all into GitHub. Open folder, and then cancel this live server. Oop. Good. Open folder. Nice film project. Terminal. Good. Git pull. Are y'all caught up? Yep, good. So if I was to go live here, so right now this is completely unstyled. Right? This is the step we're at in our project development lifecycle. Now is when we need to get this template styled and get it to a stage where we can split off the work and have everyone in the team go and take individual assignments. So we've still got to build all these separate pages. We've now got all these blocks in place so that we can style them and see what they're going to look like. But we need to get styled kind of from top to bottom. We need to pick our color scheme. What does our header look like? What is our menu going to look like? And so what I'd like to have you do is, Olivia, you're going to lead this effort. You can, yeah, I'll just leave it there. You can lead this effort. You can either be the screen sharer, or you can designate somebody on the team as the screen sharer and to be the one to do the typing. And you're going to collaboratively design this page kind of from top to bottom and get it to a state where you're like, oh, that looks pretty good, right? Using any of the techniques. We're going to live entirely inside of style.css for the rest of today, right? This file, right? All of our styles that should be in here, starting from like background color is, blue, right? So we're going to go from top to bottom and try to make this page look like something we'd be proud of, right? You guys already picked a really nice color palette. And if you go to GitHub, right, we've already kind of, right, we've got color scheme variables in here, right? These should be put in as variables, and we should start figuring out what makes sense stylistically to capture the feeling of our project, right? So Olivia, you're in charge. Take it away. How do you want to run this crew for the next hour?
Well,